Mediopolis, Chapter 18 continued. The older Theo had gone to visit the family home. Older Theo Stew, as he was known, not to be confused with younger Theo Stew. Older Theo Stew had been at the house and wanted to learn much more about the mountain beliefs, having met the older man as well. He was there visiting the younger student's son about his media studies. His media theology was one part of that elder Theo Stew could talk to him about, though he knew little and was still learning about the technologies themselves. So the technological Stew would need to talk to him also. There was a technological elder Stew that would be visiting, but elder Theo Stew was only visiting for a few days. The visit would overlap with technological Stew, an older technological Stew, a professor that he would be visiting. Within the next few days, their visit would overlap, so they'd have a time to meet together for the young student studying media theologies. Older Theo Stew, though, would get to meet him before on his own. But he also met the older man, who had said about his curiosities also, and his love of nature, and he was from the mountains, and out of politeness he'd agreed to talk to him about whatever these mountain theologies and river theologies might be, just to broaden his own understanding. There really wasn't something he'd said that he'd studied at great length himself, nor knew about, because it just wasn't something that it was that pronounced and popular these days. Perhaps something from long ago that still could have some relevance, he admitted to the older man, agreeing perhaps to look at it and to discuss it if there was time. Older Theo Stew was there to meet the younger son, though, studying, of course, the theological medias and all the different ranges that he was studying. Over the years, the elders, who had been very different in their professionals, had had so many different Stews. Well, elder Theo Stew met many of the different professors also. There was the sociable Stew and social Stew. Well, he was sometimes called social steward at the house. He had grown older too now and was elder social Stew, as had all the other Stewart family, the Stews, as they were collectively known. The elder Stew all had younger stewards as well, though, that were their apprentices, their guides. They now had to guide them, their students, as happens. The elder Stews that were once younger had grown up gradually over the years, as happens. Like all the other elders, they had become elder teachers gradually, but only in their professions, not in specialist other fields where they still remained younger Stews when they went to other places and studied other subjects. They had long ago lost contact with many of the other Stews, though themselves, that they often sometimes tried to reacquaint with when the studies permitted and allowed it. Only now had the notes, books, films, and whatever other records of the thoughts been left behind in significant numbers, that old Theo, really had the time now to devote to such studies, that he decided to contact some of the other older Stews. As he was older Stewart himself, and however distant or close, the Stewart family was still connected, many more than others, however distant sometimes those relations were. There was sociological Stew at the house, who had a great experience and knowledge of different societies. He and the other social Stews, they'd all studied different societies and so many of them. Social Stew, as he was known in the house, not to be confused with socialist Stew, of course, or sociable Stew even. They had very different personalities, but they were related to sociological Stew himself, although they had a very different way and different understanding of society itself and a different relationship to it too. There was socialite Stew, of course, who was really the life and soul of a good party, fun to be around. He was good at networking, meeting people, connecting, understanding, relating to people, conveying lots of information in concise, relevant ways that was sensitively delivered too. He understood people's psychology, how to interact with them, how to gesture, relate, speak and act around in differing social circumstances. Then there was socialist Stew, who really was outspoken and had an agenda that he wanted to treat society, that he really wanted society itself to be treated and to be healed. Socialist Stew, who had wanted the individual subordinate to society itself, and he believed in social reforms as a means to individual reforming themselves. This was his belief, though there were different beliefs as well that he had, and there were many different socialist stews as well. There were many different beliefs, of course, of the different social reforms. Then there was sociopathic Stew. He had a fear and even sometimes a dislike or a strong hatred for society sometimes, or a strong misunderstanding of society, or a distance from society itself. Not necessarily for individuals though sometimes he could, but not necessarily. It seemed unclear to old Theo at the moment whether sociopathic Stew, his fears and hatreds, were perhaps understandable even to some extent, or not in some other ways, in many ways. He had a mixed feelings about him, and about all the other stewards too, really. There were neither that were only good or only bad. They all had the potential to be very good or very bad, in fact, depending on how they were performing, what they were doing, and why they were doing it too, essentially. So old Theo had very mixed feelings about all the different stews that he'd met, and so many of their different beliefs. About all the Stuarts that were clearly closely related and involved within society, for better or worse. Except, of course, asocial Stew. Well, he was the odd one out of their group, wasn't he? Wasn't there one in every group, of course? Of the so's, or the socials, the social group, as old Theo called them. He seemed indifferent, old asocial Stew, indifferent to the prescribed social rules that there apparently were, neither trying to impose them upon other people, nor uphold them himself, nor was he trying to go out of his way to break them even, or to study them and even know what they were. As his logical sociologist friend would of course be studying them rigorously at least, even if he wasn't necessarily pushing them or upholding them or defending them. The asocial Stew tried to limit his contact within society wherever he could, of course. Whereas the sociologist Stew, he had to be immersed himself within society, into the time and place of the society itself. He had to be subordinated to society, to deeply, truly, to understand what it was to live and experience within that society itself. To study it was to know it for him from within, not as some abstract outsider studying it from a distance, looking from the outside, but as someone experiencing it subjectively, himself from within, and also to know the others, also, to have a familiar relation to others that were experiencing that same society that he could know and study and experience from within himself. And not just be a foreigner and have a foreigner's view of it, an outsider's eye, as asocial Stew was and had to a greater extent. Sociologist Stew had his own beliefs, of course. Then there was socialist Stew, socialite Stew, sociopathic Stew, all the social stews, of course, and the asocial Stew, or called the social group, or as the elder Stew called them. That's what old Theo liked to call them, lumping them in as one group, although they often conflicted with each other as much as complemented each other sometimes, such were their varying, differing group relations to each other, as they all had some differing relationship to each other, even to a social Stew. Who made up the fifth member of such a group, such a strange group, although the asocial was not really an actual member of the group and wouldn't meet with the others that often, except sometimes perhaps when he had to. Old Theo wanted a chat with all of them at some point during the night time or the day, whenever there was the right time and place. Because if he was to have a good understanding of society, he'd have to know really what he was leaving behind if he was going to make such a momentous journey towards the mountains, however temporarily, because of the risks and also the sheer amount of effort that it would make. He wouldn't know if he would be returning or if it was possible to. So he really wants to have a broader, better understanding of society, to get to know those deeply more involved within the society, much more before he'd ever think of leaving it truly. He wanted to know also what it was he was leaving. Despite having spent so much long time within that society, he felt he only really understood certain aspects of it, those professions that he just happened to work within, and those relationships he just happened to have, those parts and urban areas of society he happened to live in, he understood much better than many other places that he'd visited much less often, professions he had little contact with, or had never worked in and had little contact with friends or family that had either. So he wanted to have a better understanding of those social implications, of those social forces, of those social desires of others in society that he'd become less familiar with over the years and decades, over vast periods of time. He still felt that he had a lesser understanding of society, that it was a mysterious society, still to some extent. That's exactly what he thought about the mountains, calling it somewhat known but somewhat mysterious too. But meditating and thinking on society, wasn't that also true of society as well as the mountains too? Old Theo had thought in his meanderings, looking back over his study notes. Perhaps there'd be time to meditate on society also at the mountains, and that he wouldn't be totally leaving it all behind. Of course not. He would be looking back and thinking of his life beforehand anyway. His experiences and memories, those would help to make up who he was at the time and to make up how he dealt with situations. And he might be too busy, though, dealing with the situation there, dealing with the mountain and whatever its problems might afford him with, and whoever else he might meet there too. He might be too overwhelmed with that, really, to look back and to know deeply what it was that he'd been living within. And not knowing if he'd be able even ever to return from such a mountain if he went on such a journey, then what would be the point of looking back to a place he might not be able to go to? So it was better to study a place while you were within it, he thought, at least. Then he might be saying goodbye to society for however long. Perhaps he wanted to make sense of it all and the social relationships as much as he could while there was still time to. So there were the different social people and social groups to get in contact with, the social students at the house that would be visiting. Then he marked down on a list the 5 different social individuals, the 5 different social stews that he wanted to get in contact with, and try to reason and understand them, and to resolve some of the issues, if possible, if he could, and perhaps in apologising or forgiving any wrongs that may have been done, that he might understand if he had made some, and expected that he may have made many in fact, trying to understand what was going on in society and what had been therefore his relationship to these mysterious societies he'd known lesser about over the years. Sometimes they seemed as much of a mystery now as the mountains themselves, although he was still within it himself. Only they were a long way off, so distant from him, so the mountains and their mysteries was much more understandable, therefore. Then there were all the psychological stews as well, another group, though much more related than other groups were. Another interesting, fascinating group too. Not that you'd put them all together, certainly not in the same room. However rare would that ever happen? What were the circumstances that would ever make all the psychological or the psi stews meet together? He really couldn't imagine such a circumstance, nor all the social stews, or the so stews, for short term as he called them. He would never imagine them all in a group together, or in the same room or house, perhaps only in the same city. Well, perhaps in the same discussion together sometimes. If you put them all together in a room, it would make an interesting show at any rate for an audience to participate within. Perhaps not necessarily for all the participants all of the time, because there could be difficult challenges within them all trying to relate and understand and be considerate towards each other. It would need firm and fair chairs for such a meeting, if anything such happened. There were the psi stews as well, of course, another well-known group that would need to be contacted, the older Theo thought. There was the psychologist, who was in a close relationship with the sociological stew. Psychological stew had a much closer relationship to sociological stew. They had a combined twin relationship almost. They had psychological, sociological students and sociological, psychological students, socio-psycho students and socio-psycho students and psycho-socio students. The psychiatrist then was closely related to the psychologist, where they were closely related too, practically brother subjects. Yet the psychiatrist prescribed, whilst the psychologist only described four people. Then there was the psychopath, closely related to the sociopath, sociopathic stew, closely related to psychopathic stew, who was unable to feel emotions for others, just as the sociopathic stew was not able to feel for society, perhaps having a fear of society, or perhaps a hatred of it, or perhaps just a mistrust of it in some way. And perhaps that was true to some extent in differing combinations of other individuals, or it was true of other societies for sociopathic stew. Perhaps there was a mistrust of other societies, perhaps a hatred of other societies, or perhaps a fear of them too for sociopathic stews, or perhaps some combination of those three, or more one or a couple than the other. Many people could be psychopathic or sociopathic to varying extents. All people could be to smaller extents, of course. Sometimes because of the circumstances, one had to be, in fact. Or sometimes just through choice, one chose to be sometimes. Even though it could well be a rational choice sometimes, especially since we all can have a fear of unknown people, unknown societies, unknown situations. Perhaps psychopathy and sociopathy can occur when there is not also that counterbalance, that desire and that love of discovering new people also, new potential friends, as well as also new potential friendly societies that could also counterbalance against those fears that we all have of the new potential enemies, the new potential fears, the new potential harms, the new potential harmful societies that we may discover, as well as new potential beneficial, loving societies too. Then completing the Psi family, as the old Theo and other older stews called them for short, there was the psychedelic also, and then there was the psychic as well, who aren't really considered students as such, but not officially. No, they were called pseudo subjects by many, of course, though they were still committed to their subjects to great extents as well. And many believed in them, even though they were never officially recognised or accepted within academia as official subjects themselves, though many other individuals had an interest and a fascination with them also. Although there were many individuals and societies that used various psychoactive drugs and that had psychedelic experiences as well, and psychedelic phenomena that were reported in many societies and individuals also, that could have both good and bad effects as well on the individual and society, but too numerous were the reports and all the evidence to really generalise about any kind of specific overall outcomes. At its worst, the misuse and overuse of psychedelic substances and psychedelic material could lead to psychosis itself, a severe mental breakdown, which could be caused by any number of factors combined in the individual or even within whole societies themselves as well. And many psychedelic users have not experienced this psychosis, however. Whether their uses are beneficial to some extent or even benign and have no real effect, or even malignant to some differing extent, a little malignant, or in fact greatly so, perhaps, or even necessary, perhaps, to some others. These debates remain contentious as to whether they are useful or harmful and to what extent, depending on the different psychedelic material and the different psychedelic substances and the different psychedelic situations that could occur. Psychedelics may be loved by some, in fact, may be hated and feared by many others, and there could be a good reason for both, and maybe irrational reasons too. And they can also be mysteries to many others, and just simply be unknown what they are to a greater many too, and be of no particular concern and of no particular relevance, and something that just wasn't necessary to study by many others as well. So varied were the views, therefore, of so many, with so many different experiences and so much different evidence as well to weigh up, that it was very hard, difficult, impossible in fact, to really make any generalizations about such vastly differing experiences. Last but not least is the question of whether these psychic phenomenons are really real and what the psychic experiences were. There were the psychics and the psychic claims as well. Were there really psychic people and psychic experiences? Even psychic animals were claimed about too. Perhaps psychic trees and psychic mountains and psychic elemental forces. Who knew? And psychic experiences of all sorts were recorded and reported. Well, there were all manner of different psychic claims. As to whether they were real or not, there were great debates and contentions about those, of course. There were many claims about psychic people that were able to read or to know other people and situations in some ways that they couldn't know from merely observing people or from the observation, not from the psychological observations alone. Through some supernatural means, perhaps, they were able to sense what the situation and what the unknown psychological reality was, to give a super psychological reading that is not dependent upon the actual psychological situation. But those were debated and unknown. Whether those were fully proven ever was still contentious. The older Theo hadn't seen anything that was absolutely proven beyond all doubt, yet still there was enough evidence to rouse his curiosities and to make him wonder the sheer amount and variety, the colourfulness, the vividness of some of those recollections too. Even if they weren't absolute in their evidence, there was surely enough to make him wonder, and many others too. But he kept an open mind on those things, still not knowing and not sure if psychic phenomenon and some psychic claims could be real and genuine, even if others clearly had a motive to exaggerate or to make up stories entirely for fascination and wonder, to make money, or even just to attract attention and intrigue from other people as well. Surely there were perhaps many false charlatans who practice this pseudoscience of alleged psychic phenomenon and psychic readings, but that didn't necessarily mean they all were, and that there weren't others that could potentially be genuine psychic readings, that could even make psychic mistakes sometimes as well, even if there could potentially be some genuine psychic beliefs of people perceiving psychic phenomenon through extraordinary measures and means that were unknown, that were supernatural, or extrasensory perceptions that were not psychologically understood or clearly recordable. Perhaps those things existed. Again, on the psychics, there were so many varied thoughts and beliefs that there were those who were extremely skeptical, deeply unsure, and those that believed they were good and bad in their beliefs, or that they were relatively benign and had little effect on others in reality. Some may think that the psychics were in touch, perhaps, and believe that they were in touch either with God or with gods, many gods, or with angels or demons, or perhaps with other spirit entities. Many believe that they were in contact with those passed on, or with ancestors, or ghosts, perhaps, or with a whole variety of different spirit entities, different spirit forces that some believed. Some believed that all psychics were just demonic. Others believed that they were really in touch with angels themselves and had a special divine connection to them. Others believed that they were just simply in touch with all different kinds of spirits. Others believed that through seances they could be in contact with just those spirits that had passed on in the recent history, in the last few months or years, that their family still had a close, intimate, emotional connection to still, through their dreams and lived experiences, perhaps. And there were others that thought that there were other kinds of unknown spirits that they were in contact with. And neither a force, perhaps for good or bad, neither angelic nor demonic, others had thought. Others still disbelieved in the psychic's powers entirely, and thought that it was all just mumbo-jumbo, made up, fictional, delusional in fact, believing it all just to be merely psychological techniques only, and that it was all only the imagination, and that it was just pseudoscience, and that it was merely psychological factors that could all be explained by rational explanations that were either unknown or that were skewed or that were purposefully hidden or mistaken and unknown to the people performing it themselves, perhaps. The psychics were perhaps not in touch with any supernatural powers the skeptics had thought, and were not just perhaps frauds potentially or charlatans. They could potentially be genuinely mistaken and mentally ill themselves, experiencing some hallucinations, whether auditory or visual. Or perhaps they were just not rational people in general and not capable of making logical enough conclusions and not scientifically trained enough to make such true assessments of such difficult, challenging phenomenon. Those were the views of many skeptics, of course. And then many others varied in their views about the psychics themselves. There were so many differing views about not just the psychologist, the psychiatrist, the psychic, and the psychedelics, but about all of them as well, and the psychopathic as well. All of the social students had very many different views about them, as well as the psychology students as well. The older student, old Theo, had written the list of those in contact with that he'd want to keep in contact with much more, that he could reach out with and try to research with much more, to try to resolve some of his doubts that he still had about each of their subjects, whether they really were that, some of them, because they were each a great challenge and still an intrigue to him and many others. Some that he still feared much knowing about, and others that he desired to know much more, and some that he felt both a great desire and a great fear about also. He wrote a list down of the sociologist, the sociologist, the socialist, the socializer, the sociopath, and the asocial, the psychologist, the psychiatrist, the psychedelic, the psychopathic, and the psychic also. Those 10 that he wanted to get in contact with. Were those the 10 people that he'd have to resolve some issues with? And would he have to resolve all the understandings with them and what their relationships that they had too also were with each other? Old Theo had decided to study much more on what the mysterious mountain religions were before meeting the older man. He didn't want to appear before him without knowing anything at all about it. And what were the other student sons, animal religions, the animism and the animistries that he'd referred him to? What were those about? Never mind the tree religions or the river religions. He'd just studied human religions at the theological studies. He didn't really know that much about those, though he'd had to study the animism much more with the student son that he'd been working and studying with. In that sense, the humanistic religions were perhaps, they were much more philosophies sometimes, and also overlapped with psychologies too sometimes, rather than just being only theology alone. Yet he didn't really want to make any assumptions before investigating them all much more fully. It also perhaps depended upon how one defined what was a religion. Old Theo had known well the term religion had come from the Old Latin, religio, translated in old term as an obligation, or as a bond and reverence towards something or someone. Yet other definitions of religion would also define it later as a system of faith, of devotion and worship perhaps, or even just the belief, a belief in the supernatural of something. So given there were a number now of different understandings, of different definitions of the term, it seemed necessary to try and determine also what those religious convictions of the different groups were. Was it something that was just a reverence, an honouring of something? Or was it actually worshipping something itself, of following it blindly, of following it totally, of being totally submitted to it, or just revering and honouring it and dignifying it? Or was it something that could not be fully understood, that could not be revered if it was not understood, that could not be fully followed either if it was a transcendental belief, or belief in something transcendental? Then how could it be followed if it was not fully understood? How could it be revered if it was still not fully understood? Could there ever really be a fully understood religion or theology if it was having to ever continuously evolve in its understanding, if its belief was in something transcendental itself that could never be captured or fully understood or fully known by any person in any particular circumstance that had the restraints of time and place. Well, perhaps it was just those different definitions that there were, the different understandings of the different religious terms, the different theological terms, that could well mean that there were the three different understandings of the related terms. Those ideas that perhaps had led to many different confusions in the discussions with the family so far. And the other students also, even the older Theo students, who, like him, seemed also sometimes confused that there were several different terms, very different meanings, but all used often for very much the same thing. Sometimes on what was and what was not a religion, sometimes that depended on how one defined it, on what one used, and on how one sensed the using of the words too. If anything revered as sacred was described as a religion or as a theology itself, then it was possible to think of tree religions perhaps, and river religions, even ocean religions, and mountain religions too, as that alone. Perhaps they were that if it was sacred to those people, studying sacredly or believing in those beliefs sacredly. Even animal religions could be too, or the tree beliefs too. Can be teachers of humanity, perhaps, to respect and honour them in their own way and to revere them. Just as they could be, like rivers could teach us, and oceans could be viewed as great teachers too, perhaps, ones that should be revered as much as great providers and full of mysteries themselves to learn about, however easy or difficult their challenges might be. Even to the many animals, they could be viewed as teachers themselves, as much as they could just be entertainers of interest sometimes. They could be honoured and respected in some ways, of course, without necessarily ever being turned into any kind of deities, or to be turned into supernatural beings, or to be classified as aliens, or angels, or demons, or supernatural beings, or gods of any sort. There was no necessary for any of that, for them to be honoured or respected and revered in some ways, whether they were desired in their knowledge or feared also in some ways too. Although there were many other religions that perhaps had featured tree gods of some sort, especially in the north he'd heard of, and of course a great many other various river goddesses that were described and written about frequently in the mythologies of stories and legends, gods of the oceans, gods of the stars and the sky, and of the underworld too, and of the mountains also. There were said to be gods of the moon and the sun and the stars. So yes, it was possible that others had a religious conviction more than just revering and venerating and respecting the natural phenomenon themselves of nature. That didn't necessarily supernaturalize it all, though. Others had those supernatural beliefs of the natural phenomenon, and others just revered them as a great thing and the pinnacle, a hierarchy, a wonderment, without defying it or deifying it themselves. You could revere and respect something and even follow the stars without necessarily worshipping or blindly following them yourself. There were religions that venerate and study with devotion the natural phenomenon, and religions that perhaps had worshipped it and lived more and had dwelt and centered their lives around the natural phenomenon, exalted it in some ways, would even live and die and kill for it, perhaps. That's not to say that people have only had one religious phenomenon, that they only worshipped that alone, unless they had the universe or a singular God, a monotheism God. They often had many others, and sometimes did, so that people may have had many different combinations of different beliefs as well that combined, so that people may bind themselves to a number of different things, a number of different ways. Sometimes people may revere animals and trees and mountains and rivers and also stars if they'd studied and known those things intimately, and the moon and the sun, and yet many other things too. Yet they may not revere humanity themselves, and believe that there is something more corrupt and fallen and unreligious about humanity itself, about humanity in general. Others may revere or even worship other people, yet never worship other natures like animals or like the people or like trees or mountains, viewing them all as lesser beings and incapable of that divine holy communion with God that only humans could have. Well, there may be many others that also have very different beliefs as well. Some may venerate animals and human nature together and see them both as sacrosanct as well, yet only worship the mountain themselves, or the stars, or only the angels, or just only God, or only worship nothing at all. There were just so many differences and different combinations and possibilities in what and how people venerate and respect and what they also worship and put the centre of their lives. Many people worshipped nothing, of course, and honoured a great many things, and perhaps honoured a great many people, and many beings, Others may honour just a few things, or a few people, in fact, and a few other beings, yet may worship and follow blindly God, or the gods that they believe in, perhaps. There can be no end of different beliefs and combinations. So there are the beliefs in mountain gods, river gods, tree gods, human gods, animal gods, sea gods, ocean gods, earth goddesses, star gods, sun gods, moon gods, even the other planetary gods. Then there were the beliefs in just the mountain teachers, in mountain guides, or perhaps in mountain preachers, or mountains to revere as sacrosanct, and river teachers, tree teachers, human teachers, animal teachers, sea teachers, ocean teachers, earthly teachers, star teachers, sun teachers, moon teachers, and even the other planetary teachers too, that were honoured and seen as something respectful to learn from. Of course, there were the other beliefs too, in the mountain monsters, river monsters, tree monsters, even human monsters and animal monsters. Then the sea, the ocean monsters too. The earth monsters, star monsters, sun monsters, moon monsters, and even the other monster planetaries that were described in many of the myths and stories and legends of all the different stories of the records. Then we know that there are the unknown beliefs as well. People that believe there is still a mystery to be found in all these things, that there is something mystical, enigmatic, unknown about all these phenomena still, something still great hidden within to learn, that we still should honor and respect as much as we can, yet that we also still have to learn what it is truly deeply, to know how we are, to be better informed of what it is, to be related closely to what it is, to have better, closer relations to what it is, to have a more complete understanding of it too. So if some or many are still looking at the natural phenomenon of mystical and unknown, concealed from us, then we cannot really know what to call it, and perhaps should not call it any name. We may think it seems beneficial or monstrous in some ways, yet not know really, truly, deeply enough about such a profound, ubiquitous phenomenon, that we may respect it to a point and be wary of it too up to a point, yet there may still be such greater mysteries of it all still to learn. So in many ways, in many beliefs, there are still the mysterious rivers, mysterious trees, mysterious fruits of the trees, and perhaps the still growing or undiscovered ones too, and the mysterious people that are from mysterious lands, mysterious towns and mysterious houses, people that can be mysterious to each other, and the mysterious animals still unlearnt, and all the other mysteries, the sea mysteries, the ocean mysteries, a big, deep, wide mystery itself, the mysterious sun, the moon mysteries, the earth mystery, as much as all the star mysteries as well, and of course, all of the other mysterious unknown planets as well. A universe of mysteries, to some extent perhaps a god, a mysterious god, even to many others. Everything can be mysterious in different places and time, so you can never know everything about everyone. You can never know everything about everywhere. You can only know some things about some people some of the time. Yet none of us can know all of the things, not about all of the people, and not all of the places, and never all of the time.